Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to have you on this SAFE webinar on this Wednesday in October. I'm delighted to welcome a familiar face to us is Amy White, who's an employment lawyer and trainer with Loch HR. And Loch HR are a provider to SAFE in terms of HR resources. And Amy's going to present something on communication conundrums. And I just think this is a really relevant subject, not only in your working relationships in the funeral home, but actually might be quite relevant to your household, to the community groups that you engage with. And sometimes there are sort of unconscious as well as conscious methods of how we communicate, and Amy's going to be touching on things like that and explore how we can improve our communications. Amy's familiar to us. She's done 2 education days with us, and I suppose my tip of the day at the beginning of this webinar is, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. And Amy, it's so good to see you, and I'm going to hand over to you and we'll come back for questions at the end. So just to say to our members, any questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll pick them up at the end of the session. Thank you, Amy.
Lovely. Thank you, Terry. Really good to be here, to see you all again, not in an education day this time, but via remote means. As Terry has said, we are going to be looking at communication today, something that is tricky. And unfortunately, in the workplace, my experience as an employment lawyer has shown me is often the source of, or the cause of, complaints and concerns, conflicts, and unfortunately, even claims. So with that in mind, we're going to be having a think today about some of the issues that can arise where communication is concerned and providing some top tips for doing a better job where we can, where communication is concerned. There's no magic bullet, but there are some things that we can bear in mind, and that thinking back to my time as an employment lawyer, if things had been different, it might have made a big difference to the outcome. Brief introductions then. Terry's already mentioned Loch HR. The overall company that I work for is Loch Associates Group, which includes not only the HR arm, but also employment, business and immigration lawyers, workplace mediators who go in and unpick employee disputes that have arisen by communication, and also this training and wellbeing arm that I head up. As Terry said, my background is as an employment lawyer. So until 3 years ago, I was in practice as a partner with a regional law firm. I worked mostly with employers, putting in place policies and procedures and ways of doing things that endeavoured to reduce the likelihood of employment tribunal claims arising. But I also worked with a lot of employees who were dissatisfied with things that have happened in their workplaces. And what I would say is, so often the complaints that they came to me with related to communication in the workplace. So it's a source of contention and consternation. So we will be digging into it today. What we're going to be looking at are some fundamental questions. What is communication? Why is it important? But particularly those top tips. How can we communicate well in the workplace? And what can we go away and do as homework today? And of course, as Terry said, time for a bit of Q&A at the end if there are any questions. I'm very conscious that the content I've put together is quite soft skills focused today. But if you have questions that are more on the HR side or perhaps the employment law side, feel free to ask away. If I don't have a question, an answer off the top of my head, I'm sure we can come back to you at a later stage. So let's move on to that first question then. What is communication? Well, there are a number of different definitions out there. If you were to Google this, all sorts of things would come up. Some that I like include the process of sending and receiving messages, but also the creation and exchange of meaning. There are different ways of categorizing communication. Some will say verbal on the one hand and non-verbal on the other. Others would add in some other categorizations, perhaps written communication and also visual communication, particularly in the modern era when we can convey meaning and messages through things like emojis. However we define or categorize communication, it is worth acknowledging that it is critical in our workplaces and critical to the success of our workplaces. Terry's alluded to the fact that that goes beyond employment relationships to people that you work with, service providers that you work with. For the purposes of our session, we're going to be focusing on the workplace, but bear in mind, this of course goes beyond that, and even, as Terry said, into your domestic environments as well. I said at the beginning, there's no magic bullet for getting communication right, but what we can do is think about some top tips, some key techniques that can improve the way we communicate. And the first thing that's worth doing is just having a look at the communication cycle that's on the slide here. This is what happens in basic terms when we are communicating. We have a...
You're right back, Amy. So
curious. I'll plug on in the hope that there's no issue. We were talking about the communication cycle. It might look simple on first glance. Transmitter with a message, sends it across, receiver receives it. But it probably won't surprise you to know that actually it's more complicated than that. There's a lot of interference can get in the way. From the transmitter side, perhaps we've got too much information being provided or too little information being provided. Perhaps we're using jargon that means that the recipient can't really understand what we're talking about. Maybe our information is incorrect or out of date, which creates a barrier and that interference. On the other end of the scale, the receiver might be encountering interference. Perhaps they're not really present, they're not really focused and listening. Maybe there are a lot of distractions going on, physical and perhaps more emotional even. Perhaps there are perception issues. There's a bias in terms of the transmitter or the type of information that's being conveyed. But all that interference serves to get in the way of getting that message across and means that the intention doesn't always marry up with the impact. And alongside that, it's worth us just bearing in mind that when we are communicating, when we are transmitting that message, the bulk of our delivery isn't, as we might suspect, the words we use, but rather the stuff that comes with that. The body language that we use, as the slide says, body movements, facial expressions, gestures with our arms, and also those non-verbal cues and things like tone and pace and modulation, pauses, emphasis, etc. That graphic, I think, is quite astounding, actually, the proportion of the message that we convey being conveyed via that body language and that tone and modulation rather than the words we use. So whilst in an employment context, I certainly wouldn't suggest that the words we choose are not important. They certainly are, and they can trip us up if we choose them incorrectly. It's worth bearing in mind how much the other stuff really does impact the message that's received by the recipient. So having thought about what communication is, and I really hope that did get through, because I can see somebody saying that the screen or the presentation had frozen twice for them. So I hope the bulk of what I've just said has come across. I think it's quite typical that we're having connection issues when I'm talking about communication and getting messages across. But moving on then to why communication is important. And again, of course, it's valid that communication is important in all walks of life, but just focusing on the workplace for a moment. Conscious that we may have on this call leaders of organizations, people managers, and also staff and employees. And it's worth saying that communication affects everybody differently in the workplace. It might be that you are a leader of an organization and you regularly get feedback that staff don't feel your communication is transparent enough. And we know that that can have an impact on things like trust, motivation, morale, engagement. Likewise, if you are a team leader or a people manager of some description, it could be that you are having a bit of a rub with particular team members. Maybe you are not finding ways to communicate with them that help with understanding their needs, that allow you to give instruction in a way that is clear, or to ensure that that employee understands what their roles and responsibilities are, and as a result, results in some sort of mistakes or errors arising. And finally, you may be an employee in an organization and you're struggling with communicating with colleagues, for instance. Perhaps you're struggling to build rapport with particular colleagues, or maybe actually there's issues in your workplace around the style of communication, the use of inappropriate language. In legal terms, we would be thinking about things like harassment there, but maybe it's not quite up to that level, but it's something that's causing you an issue. At every level of an organization, communication is important and has the potential to have a ripple effect. And I just want to back that statement up with some stats. I'm not going to read what's on the slide. Hopefully my screen isn't frozen and you can see everything clearly. But it's clear that communication is a workplace worry for many. At Loch Associates, we often run listening programs for organisations where we will meet with their staff in groups and try to understand what's great about the organisation, but also where pinch points exist. And we also roll out staff surveys, engagement surveys, satisfaction surveys, and the like. And what I would say is it's inevitable that communication will be up there as one of the key sources of dissatisfaction. It's so often an area that we can do a lot to improve. As I said, if you're an employee, it might be that you don't feel that the leadership is being transparent, or maybe you're not getting the input you need from your manager. But equally, as managers, sometimes we feel that we're not getting open communication from our staff. Perhaps people aren't telling us when they're struggling or need extra support. Maybe they hide mistakes rather than bringing us in at an early stage when we could assist. Maybe a particular staff member is having this ongoing rub with a colleague that's resulting in a conflict that you as the manager are then having to come in and resolve. But what we also know is that whilst it's a common workforce complaint, if we get communication right, it can have real business benefits. We know that it can increase performance and productivity, and actually it can increase retention by almost 5 times. So really important at a time when we are having issues where recruitment and retention are concerned in many industries. But the key question then, having understood what communication is and why it's important, is to understand how we can communicate effectively. Well, the first thing that I just want to start with is highlighting the importance of listening. It sounds really basic, but actually it's something that we could all do with refreshing and reminding ourselves of on a regular basis. The slide shows that actually it would appear many of us think we are quite good listeners, but the reality, in my experience, is that often we're not that great. Whether we are employees who are just focused on the day-to-day and unable to find time for our colleagues and our peers, whether we are managers who are sort of caught in that middle ground, stuck between leadership on the one hand and employees that we manage on the other, our listening, generally speaking, could be better. And I think that quote from Stephen Covey on the slide there, most people don't listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply, is something that definitely resonates with me, and perhaps it does with you as well. There are a number of reasons why communication and listening particularly is challenging in the workplace. I've mentioned time, I've mentioned sort of the positional pressures, but we've also just got basic things like physical barriers to good listening, interference, interruptions, phones ringing, email notifications popping up. And alongside that, perhaps more perceptual or emotional barriers, as I said before, biases that we might have, prior experiences that influence how well we engage with our listening. So I just wanted to give you a how-to guide where what we would call active listening is concerned. You might have heard of active listening before. It's going beyond just hearing what somebody is saying and actually engaging with the overall message that they are trying to convey. So not just the words that they're using, going back to that diagram, but also how they are communicating, their tone, their body language. So a quick rundown of this how-to guide. Well, the first thing is to go into a conversation where we're trying to do a bit of active listening, being fully present. Really hard when we're busy, really hard in the modern world when we've got so many ways that people can communicate with us. But it really does mean putting the phone on D&D, switching off our email notifications, ensuring we are in an environment where we can be focused on the individual in front of us and not distracted by other things going on around us. The second thing is we walk through the door for that communication and we put our mindset on that we have something to learn here, rather than thinking, oh, here we go again, or I know what's coming, believing we have something to learn and going in with that genuine mindset. We then need to do the tapping into tone and be wearing the body language that I mentioned on the earlier slide. What is that individual's tone telling us when they're speaking? Are they rushing? Do they sound quite despondent? Are they sighing? Are they pausing a lot for reflection? Or are they, on the other hand, speaking at a loud volume, sounding perhaps a bit aggressive? And likewise, think about the body language that the individual is demonstrating. Are they slumped on the desk? Is their head in their hands? Are they fidgeting in a nervous way? But also, when you are doing the listening, think about your own body language. Is it open? Is it calm? Is it creating an environment that encourages the individual to speak? If we're asking questions, it's really sensible to use open questions. And when I say open questions, I mean the 5 W's and H: who, what, where, when, why, and how. These are questions that can't be answered with a yes or a no and shut down the conversation. Instead, they're questions that encourage elaboration. The only one I would caution a little bit of sensitivity around is the use of why questions. They can sound a bit accusatory. Why did you do that, for instance? And as a result, they can cause people to become slightly defensive in their response. But keep those open questions in mind and try and use them, particularly if someone appears a bit shut down and you want to try and unlock them. Important to try and go with the flow. And this goes back to Stephen Covey's quote. Something might come up when somebody is speaking to you and you think, I need to respond to that point. I need to reply to what they've said. And that thought then just goes round and round in your head, distracting you from what the speaker is actually saying. So try and let those thoughts come into your head, but let them go again. Don't focus on them. Don't worry about recalling them. Go with the flow of what the speaker is saying. And if at the end of what they've said, you need to pause to think about your response or anything you want to follow up on, that's fine. Actually, what it shows the speaker is you've been with them throughout and you are considering your response carefully. Think about your eye contact. It's part of body language, but it's a significant part. We don't want to be staring at somebody because, of course, that can be quite uncomfortable. But likewise, we don't want to be not making any eye contact, looking away, appearing to maybe wish we were anywhere but where we are at that present moment. Again, the only thing that I would just be aware of here is that for some neurodivergent individuals, eye contact can feel fairly tricky. So don't interpret a lack of eye contact in all cases as meaning that somebody isn't engaged with you. Just bear in mind that it could be that there is a neurodivergence there. Importantly, we don't want to equate our experience. We don't want to shift the attention back to us when we're supposed to be doing the listening. So if somebody says something about an experience that's familiar to you, resist the urge to say, I've been there. It sounds just like a time when because of course, instead of supporting, we are then shifting. I mentioned that pauses are good. I know it's really uncomfortable, but actually silence is something to be embraced. It gives you time to think about what you want to say next, what you want to pick up on. But also it can encourage the speaker to go further. If there is a moment of quiet, they may decide that they actually want to add something more that they've been holding back. And finally, make summarizing, paraphrasing, repeating your friend. It really demonstrates that you have been listening, you have been following, but it also ensures that if you have missed anything or misinterpreted anything, there is that moment to clarify, which again shows the individual that has been speaking, you're there with them, you're taking it seriously. So a quick how-to guide of how to do some active listening. And I will repeat it at the end, but I would encourage everybody to take this away and have a little practice. Maybe at home later, see if you can do a bit of active listening, or maybe with anybody that you encounter in the last few hours of the working day today. Moving on then, the next communication element that I just wanted to touch on is empathy. Something we hear spoken about a lot at the moment in HR and people management circles, but something that's often a bit misinterpreted. Empathy isn't just being sympathetic or being nice. It's actually trying to see a situation from another person's perspective. And I often think actually the best way to understand what empathy is or what it really sounds like is to think about what it's not. With that in mind, a what not to do list. If we're trying to be empathetic, these are things we should try to avoid. So imagine somebody comes to you in the workplace. Maybe it's a colleague if you're an employee. Maybe it's one of your direct reports if you're a manager. And says, I'm really busy. I'm so busy. In fact, I'm struggling to cope. How might we not demonstrate empathy? Well, firstly, we wouldn't one-up them. Oh, you should see my to-do list, diminishing their experience. Equally, we don't want to just fix it for them. And this is always well-intentioned when we say, well, if I just sort this out for you, or I take that bit of your workload on, we're doing it with the best of intentions. But actually, this isn't what the employee or our colleague is coming to us for. They just want to be heard and feel like you understand. We certainly wouldn't want to shut them down. Oh, you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. It really devalues what they're experiencing. We wouldn't want to advise them or story tell, where again, we shift back to us. Sounds like a time when if I were you, I would. And finally, we don't want to just explain to them how they've landed where they've landed, because they probably know that. They've probably worked it all through in their heads and worked out why they're in the situation they're in. They just want somebody to know it's hard. And finally, we don't want to just simply console them by saying, oh, don't let it get you down. It again can serve to minimize the experience that they're having, which is something we definitely don't want to do when we are doing the active listening piece and trying to empathize with them. Instead, we might want to try using phrases like, that sounds really hard. Is there anything I can do to help? That sounds really challenging. I'm here to support you. Really simple statements that don't shift that attention back to us, but instead sit with what they're experiencing at that moment, may encourage them to go further in what they want to say, but crucially ensure they feel somebody has heard what I'm saying and what I'm going through. They may then start to formulate their own solutions and fix it themselves, but they've had that moment of your time. And what I would just say here is sometimes it can seem as if this is something that managers should always practice towards employees. And while of course that is the case, it would be great in workplaces to see it practiced across from employee to employee, but also maybe a little bit upwards too. We rarely see compassion exercised upwards in employment organizations. So maybe the next time that you're in a bit of a pickle, have a think about how the manager is feeling and maybe try and exercise some empathy in that direction as well. The final thing where communication is concerned that I want to touch on are the different communication styles that exist. I've put some diagrams on the slide there. The diagram showing aggressive, assertive, passive-aggressive, and passive is probably one you've seen in some format before. Those are the 4 key communication styles we usually talk about. Aggressive communicators being those who want to win, my way or the highway. They might even violate other people's rights in the way they communicate. On the other side of the coin, passive communicators who lose out because they don't put forward what they want and need in a particular scenario. Unfortunately, what we can sometimes see there is because they suppress their wants and needs so much, we do sometimes see sort of mini explosions where things erupt because they've been so suppressed for so long. Passive-aggressive communicators can seem compliant on the surface, but actually underneath are acting out of maybe a bit of anger, maybe perhaps trying to sabotage what's going on. And in the top corner there, the assertive communicator, somebody who is trying to achieve balance. They want to be okay themselves by feeling able to express what they want and need in a situation, but also they want the other party to be okay too. So respectfully listening to that person's wants and needs as well. And it's that sense of balance that makes assertive communication really effective in the workplace. And that's why I've put the additional diagram on. You'll see there's an alignment between the two, but we're aiming for this I'm okay, you're okay style of communication. We want there to be that balance. In fact, sometimes assertiveness is described as standing up for yourself without knocking others down. That balance, I'm okay, you're okay. There's no right way necessarily to communicate, and it's quite possible that you have found yourself dipping into one of those 4 or all of them in the course of your working life. And perhaps also you know people that sit in some of those boxes on a more long-term basis. But in general terms, assertiveness is going to be the most effective way of communicating because it does achieve that balance. Sometimes people subscribe to some myths where assertiveness is concerned. It's rude to say what I want and need. It's selfish in some way. It's not my style. I can't learn to do it. A few myths that go along with it, maybe aggression by another name. None of those myths are true. Actually, it's a really achievable way of communicating and one that really does reap benefits in the workplace and outside of it. So how do we do assertiveness, if you will? Well, it goes back to that earlier diagram again, thinking about all the elements of communication, not just the words. So have a think about body language. You could probably rustle up in your mind some examples of aggressive body language, passive body language, maybe even passive-aggressive body language. Assertiveness can sometimes feel a bit more subtle, a bit more nuanced, but essentially it's standing up straight, making sure your eyes are raised, and if you're comfortable with it, you're doing comfortable eye contact. Maybe it's making gestures, but making them purposeful. It often involves maintaining your personal space, but also making sure that the person you're speaking with is also able to maintain theirs. We want to see an openness rather than a closedness so that we can create that two-way flow. Similarly, it's worth thinking about how tone, pace, modulation plays into the assertiveness piece. Think again about what aggressive or passive aggressive tone might sound like, and then try and drill into what we might want to hear where assertiveness is concerned. We want to hear a steady pace. We want to hear a conversational volume. Shouting, of course, much more associated with aggressiveness. Whispering with perhaps being passive, although it can dip into aggressiveness in some scenarios. And finally, think about the words that you are using. So I've put on the slide there, say what you mean and mean what you say. What we want to see here is clear, direct statements without lots of padding. We don't want to be too direct. I need that now, for instance, such that we appear confrontational. But on the flip side of it, we don't want to diminish our position. I'm probably wrong about this, but those kinds of padding statements. It's also sensible to try and focus on I statements where you are owning what you were talking about. So a classic example is in the workplace, somebody who maybe doesn't clean up after themselves in the kitchen area, the shared kitchen. Instead of saying, you're so lazy, you make a mess of the kitchen, which is really blame oriented and actually fairly easy to disagree with. Perhaps we would say instead, when you don't clean up the kitchen after you've used it, it makes me feel uncomfortable and I don't feel like I can go in and use it after you. Much more difficult for someone to disagree with how you have experienced or felt about a scenario. Much less blame oriented, which engenders a more positive response. And also, actually, sometimes it's really good to just get it off your chest. This is how I feel about this. You can calm down. And finally, it's worth just pointing out that assertiveness doesn't mean always being right. If that were the case, we would be tripping into aggressiveness. So actually, there will be times when we might need to apologize or accept that our way is not the way that we are going to end up going. But just be careful not to be constantly apologizing for asserting what you need or being clear about what you want. And I just wanted to touch on a particular workplace scenario where we often see people lose their assertiveness before we finish, which is the provision of or the request for feedback. Feedback in the workplace has got a pretty bad reputation, if you ask me. Instead of it being seen as something that helps us grow, helps us develop, and I've put on the slide there a definition, data for our development is how I like to think of feedback. It has sadly got a really bad reputation. People think of it as always being negative and therefore they're fearful of it. People think of it as being something that happens far away over there, annual appraisal, for instance. And people often also think of it as being very rigid and formal. You only provide feedback in a written form, for instance. We want to loosen that up. We want to make feedback a daily habit. We want to make sure it's really proximate to the event or occurrence that we're feeding back on. And the key thing is we want to make sure people understand that it's about growth and development, not about negativity. But as a result of the bad reputation that feedback has got, as I say, we lose our assertiveness where feedback is concerned. As employees, perhaps if we are worried about the feedback we're going to receive, we will lose confidence and retreat into being passive. Or maybe if we as a manager are nervous about providing feedback for fear of a not so positive response, we adopt an aggressive stance for protection. Maybe we don't even want to have that conversation, so we avoid it completely, but then in a passive-aggressive way, comment on the employee's performance outside of the scenario where we should actually be providing that direct feedback. So all manner of different ways that we lose our assertiveness when we are providing feedback. So some tips for providing feedback in an assertive way. And what I would also just say is, as employees, asking for feedback in an assertive way is something that we absolutely can do. If we make sure that we are asking for it with the focus on how can we improve, how can we be better, it's something that I'm sure our managers will be happy to provide. But how do we give feedback, whether you're a manager providing it to an employee or an employee providing it to a manager, in a way that is effective? Well, the first thing is to focus on the behavior in question. Don't allow yourself to trip into providing feedback that focuses on a personality trait or somebody's intelligence, for instance. Focus on the behavior in question as the anchor. We go back to that example about cleaning up the kitchen. We weren't focusing on the personality trait, the laziness. Instead, we were focusing on specifically what had happened, the behaviour. We also want to ensure we provide feedback on a regular basis. We make it a daily habit rather than something that happens once a year. We know that appraisals, unfortunately, tend to only look back 3 weeks instead of the full year. So there's no point saving your feedback to the annual appraisal. Do it on the regular. As the slide says there, don't delay as well. If something happens that you want to provide feedback on, do it there and then, particularly if it's something positive. Grab that moment, don't let it slip away, because the likelihood is either you'll forget to do it, or when you do it, it will feel so disconnected because of the delay that it's hard for the employee to process or act on. Talking of acting on, if we're providing feedback, we want to see some accountability. So circle back, find out how everybody got on. Was it something that we were able to work in? Do we need a bit more feedback? Again, offering feedback as your opinion, so using those I statements, is a really good way to do it. It reduces that blame position if it's more constructive feedback. It's harder to debate with or argue with if it's focused on something you have experienced. And finally, and really crucially, be specific. I defined feedback as data for your development or our development. And the key element there is that it's data. Praise is lovely, being told, good job, well done, that was great. We all need praise. However, it doesn't take us anywhere because there's no data there for us to work with. It's not tangible. So instead of good job, can we be really specific? That was brilliant because ... Okay, that is pretty much the end of the content. I wanted to keep it really short and sweet today because I know everyone's really busy, but just a few takeaway tips or things that you might want to think about in terms of homework. First up, I mentioned that so often in the workplace, the intention we have doesn't marry up with our impact when we're communicating. So this is often not a very popular suggestion, but I really recommend practicing, whether that's in front of the mirror, watching how you come across as you deliver a message, maybe recording yourself if you can stomach it, or getting a feedback buddy in the workplace where you can practice a particular communication and then get some honest feedback from your buddy. As I said, it's really easy to think that our intention matches our impact, but so often there is a big difference between the two. So doing a bit of practice will stand us in good stead. Likewise, I would really encourage everyone to think about a bit of active listening. The next time you're sitting down with somebody who really needs a bit of your time and who really needs to be listened to, maybe do the circle test. 2 circles on a piece of paper. One is for listening, one is for speaking. Every time you speak, put a dot in the speak bubble. Every time you listen, put a dot in the listen bubble. And at the end, you'll be able to see whether actually do I need to shift the distribution of speaking and listening. Remember that piece around shifting and supporting. Try to resist shifting the conversation back to us or the attention back to us, but rather supporting what somebody has said in the conversation. And also just think about people who you think are great listeners and see whether there's key elements to how they make you feel listened to that you could replicate. And finally, worth just thinking about whether we have ever asked our team members, if we're a manager, how they like to be communicated with, or told them how we like to be communicated with. And if we're an employee, have we ever told our colleagues or our manager the same kind of information? Do we even know? So it could be worth thinking about whether you carry out some sort of communication style assessment in the workplace. Not only is that really helpful just to understand from our own perspective how we prefer to be communicated with, it's also a really great fun team bonding activity. People learn loads about one another and it can spark some really interesting conversations. So we will come to a Q&A in a moment, I think, but I was just going to rattle through the last of these slides to close out. Terry, hi. I hope everyone got the rest of that presentation after that initial hiccup. I'm
sure they did. I certainly got it.
Excellent.
Do carry on with the last couple of slides if you want.
Well, I was just going to mention that we are sending Kate Rigby, our head of our HR department, to the Education Day that is taking place this weekend. She will be manning a stand, and as part of that, we'll be offering a free HR health check. So if you're going to be at the Education Day, please do go and see Kate. She will be more than happy to have a chat with you. And I think actually, even if you can't make it, we will be sending a bit of communication after this session regarding the opportunity to sign up for a free HR health check. So yeah, hopefully people will take us up on that offer.
Brilliant. Thank you, Amy. And to our members, I wondered if you've got any questions that you want to ask, and if you have, got some coming in. Amy, I'm going to kick off with one that you will have been involved in as a practicing lawyer. Yeah. So, how communications are a factor in employment tribunals? What can you tell us about that? Are the key mistakes?
Communication, I would say, is a key theme across almost all employment tribunal claims, whether you were talking about the manner of someone's dismissal. So often we will be looking at both verbal communications that there's usually a debate about what was said, but also written communications when it's gone wrong in terms of what's been written down. We see communication as a big issue in things like discrimination claims, the language that is used, the phrasing that is used. So across the whole range, actually, communication comes up as a big issue. And going back to some of the content there, I can recall instances of employees saying, my manager was very aggressive in the way they communicated with me, or there was just no communication about the redundancy, for instance. It was such a common thread that ran through any of the disputes I dealt with that I sometimes feel like I'm talking about something that's very basic, but actually it's fundamental and foundational to a lot of things that grow arms and legs in the workplace and go off to the tribunal.
Yeah. So for those managers and owners who might be in the aggressive category, sort of peer mentoring might be one way forward in terms of just actually being upfront and asking honest questions to their peers. Do I come across sometimes as aggressive, and actually sort of perhaps learning to model less aggressive with your peers. Yeah. And then for those who are quiet, we need to have more comms.
Yeah, absolutely. I think peer mentoring is a great option. I've mentioned sort of buddying up, having a feedback buddy, but peer mentoring particularly for leaders who are struggling in that space, a great way to get feedback on something that is challenging if it's something we're used to doing in a certain way. But the reality is we don't know what we don't know. So until somebody tells us how we're coming across, we often just miss it.
Yeah. Okay. Mark's given us a question here about neurodivergent community.
Yeah.
And where communication is different. Now, you did allude to this about eye contact. Is there anything else that you can give us on this in terms of how we communicate?
Yeah, let me just say, I'm just reading the question. Can you elaborate on issues for neurodivergent community for whom communication is just different, both transmission and reception? Yeah, absolutely. So we do a fair bit of training in this space at the moment, and we collaborate with an organisation who are specialists. But in general terms, again, it often comes back to asking the question of people, how do you prefer to communicate with? Are there adjustments I can make in how I communicate with you that would be of benefit? That's not only practical because actually it helps smooth the communication passage, but it's also compliant with the law. Because if somebody is neurodivergent, they may well be disabled under the Equality Act. Strange language, I know, but it's what the law has provided us with. And if somebody is disabled at law, then a duty to make reasonable adjustments arises in the workplace. We don't just, as employers, steamroll in and make adjustments that we think will work. We go to the employee and say, what would help? So actually asking the question about style of communication or format, sometimes for people speaking up is tricky, but using typing is much more comfortable. Just asking the question and then doing your best to adapt the way you work to accommodate that adjustment.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I know that when I've spoken to different groups of people that may be in this expression, that actually using sort of video and different ways of communicating. I know that someone who has ADHD, just actually where you're sitting with them, so often they don't like people wandering behind them, so they're feeling safer.
Yeah. And it's just being aware of everyone's individual experiences. The lady that I often deliver the training with sort of highlights that fact, actually everybody in the workplace has preferences. So if we can adopt an almost universal design approach where we say to everybody, what works for you? And we try our best to be individual in our approach, and making that habit. It's tricky. No one's saying it's easy, but it's certainly the goal, and it helps to get the best from people.
Okay, great. Becky's got our next question, which is, how do we communicate to someone who's not very good at communicating back, is usually very aggressive towards us? So you're anticipating an aggressive response.
Yeah, I would say, it is fairly tricky coming up against someone who is aggressive because, as I mentioned, they will have that attitude of sort of my way or the highway. I want to win in this communication. I would certainly say, rather than allowing yourself to drop into that passive style of communication, which allows that, to maintain that assertive communication, stating your wants and needs really clearly, but remaining respectful to almost take the sting out of it. It can be sensible to just gauge the dynamic. So how aggressive has it become? Are we in a hot conflict here where actually people could say things they don't mean? We're not actually going to be constructive. We could fall into becoming destructive, in which case pause the communication, say, let's come back when we're feeling a little bit more constructive in the way we want to approach things. Feeding back on a regular basis. So maybe after one of those hot conflicts, going to that individual and providing an opportunity for you to say what didn't work for you and to give them an opportunity to maybe say, actually, yes, I accept that X, Y, and Z happened. But yeah, this is why I say communication is one of the biggest issues in the workplace. We will butt up against communication styles that don't work for us. And I think it's gradual, the way we can try and work around it.
Have you ever done any anger management training through your organization?
No.
Okay, that was one other thought.
yeah, absolutely. We do have an in-house nurse who, and he's ex-military, so he does, on occasion when requested, provide sort of handling aggressive communicators or just aggression in the workplace. He has quite a lot of experience in that field, so yes, that's something that sometimes does get called upon.
Okay, we've got another one from Anne-Marie. If your colleagues need to communicate with the boss but don't, should you pass it on to the boss, or is it best to ask them to do it when it doesn't really concern you?
It's such a tricky one, isn't it? I would say there are always going to be scenarios where, on balance, you think a disclosure is vital. So if, for instance, you felt like somebody was at risk, or there were health and safety risks occurring in the workplace, then that will sort of trump any peer-to-peer confidentiality, I would say, if those risk levels are really high. But other than that, it will probably come down to personal preference. What's the relationship you've got with the individual, and how damaged might it be if actually they find out you've disclosed something they told you, as far as they believe in confidence, to their manager? Because if their manager then feels like they have to act on it, that could be a tricky one and create some frictions. But yeah, I would say those caveats will always apply if there are issues around sort of health and safety or personal risk.
Great. Thank you, Amy. And Craig is flagging up how he's appreciated to hold the questions back and do a bit more listening, it sounds like to me. So
yeah,
excellent.
Hard going though, isn't it? You want to dive straight in there and pick up on something that somebody said, but actually we don't really know what they're saying until they've finished taking that last breath. So try to be with them till the end.
Brilliant. Amy, thank you so much for being with us. There's a lot of nuggets of wisdom in this, so I do encourage our members to kind of review this slideshow, and an email is going to be coming from Loch Associates about the free HR. So thank you so much, Amy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Good. Our next webinar is on the 6th of November. Declan Maguire, our national president, is hosting Mari Mickle, who is a family business specialist who's actually at Education Day. So we're on then. Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Amy.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.